On Father's Day, my own son looked me in the eye in front of 60 people and said, "I wish you had never been my dad." I stood up, looked at the boy I had sacrificed everything for, and replied, "Then live as if you never had a father." I walked out, got into the brand new Mercedes in his driveway, and drove off. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. "Bring my car back right now or I am calling the cops." I just smiled and switched off the phone because what he was about to discover was that the car had never belonged to him. My name is Grant, and I am 70 years old. For 35 years, I held on to the belief that giving your child a better life than you had was the truest measure of a successful father. I spent 4 decades lacing up steel-toed boots, dragging myself out of bed at 4 in the morning, and pulling drywall dust into my lungs, so my son Derek would never have to know what it felt like to have calloused hands or an empty wallet. From a single used pickup truck, I built a construction and development company into a private holding empire. But I never let my wealth show. I drove an older truck, stayed in the same modest house, and wore canvas work shirts. To the outside world, and to my own son, I was nothing more than a retired blue-collar grinder scraping by on a meager pension. Welcome back to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Is it morning, where you are the middle of your afternoon? Or are you settling in late at night? Wherever you're listening from, I appreciate you. Now, a quick note: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I kept my fortune hidden because I wanted Derek to forge his own character. I wanted him to become a man of real substance. I was about to discover exactly how little of that he possessed. It was a gorgeous Sunday afternoon when I pulled up to Derek and Vanessa's suburban colonial house, Naperville, IL, for their annual Father's Day barbecue. The place was a sprawling colonial with manicured lawns, a heated pool, and an outdoor kitchen that looked like something out of a magazine spread. I came up the driveway, carrying a simple gift for my son, dressed in my usual clean but worn khakis and a comfortable plaid shirt. Before I even made it to the front door, the disrespect started. Derek stepped out of the garage wearing tailored chino trousers and Italian leather Oxfords. There was no hug, no Father's Day greeting, just his eyes darting straight to where I had parked my truck along the street. "Dad," he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as though my very presence was giving him a headache. "Could you move it a little further down the block? My partners from the firm are stopping by, and I don't want your rusty tailgate killing the curb appeal. Vanessa's parents are already here, and you know how they are." I swallowed the sting of that and gave a quiet nod. "Sure, Derek, I will move it." I walked back down the driveway, relocated the truck, and made my way to the backyard. The patio was humming with people sipping champagne and laughing. Vanessa, my 33-year-old daughter-in-law, was holding court near the pool. She stood in a linen-wrapped dress and holding a crystal wine glass, surrounded by her friends from the country club. Naperville, Wheaton area, Naperville, Wheaton area. I settled quietly at the edge of the patio with a glass of water, watching. I caught Vanessa talking loudly, pitching her voice so the whole crowd could follow along. "Oh, Derek just surprised me with it last week," she announced, gesturing toward the driveway, where a sleek black Mercedes SUV gleamed in the sun. He knows I simply cannot tolerate driving anything less than the best. It is just so exhausting keeping up with his success, you know." Her friends cooed and complimented her entirely in the dark about the truth. I took a slow sip of water. Derek hadn't bought that car. 3 weeks earlier, he had called me nearly in tears, saying he needed a safe vehicle for Vanessa and that his bonuses were delayed. He pleaded with me to help him arrange a loan. I didn't just help him get a loan. I purchased the car outright through my private holding company and let him use it, covering the insurance out of my own pocket. But listening to Vanessa paraded around as a symbol of their own success was a bitter thing to sit with. For the next 2 hours, I was treated like a ghost drifting through my own son's home. When I tried to join a conversation about the local real estate market with Vanessa's wealthy parents, Derek cut me off mid-sentence, placing a hand on my shoulder and steering me toward the grill. "Dad, why don't you just keep an eye on the burgers? You're good with your hands. Let us handle the business talk." I stood at that grill, turning burgers for strangers who barely looked my way. Every time I glanced over, Derek was laughing, slapping friends on the back, playing the role of the self-made millionaire to the hilt. He was ashamed of me. He was ashamed of the sweat and grit that had funded his private schools, his college tuition, and the very foundation of the life he was now putting on display. The tightness in my chest grew, but I kept my mouth shut. I told myself it was his day, his party, I wasn't going to make a scene. But there is only so far a man can be pushed before he pushes back. The sun dipped low, throwing a golden light across the swimming pool. Vanessa clinked a spoon against her champagne glass and called the guests to attention. She smiled and announced it was time for toasts. The crowd gathered on the patio, glasses raised. Vanessa's father went first, a long, self-important speech about how proud he was to call Derek his son-in-law, heaping praise on his ambition and his supposedly entirely self-made wealth. Then Derek stepped up. He planted himself in the center of the gathering, a glass of aged scotch in hand, face flushed from the drinking and the admiration of the crowd. His gaze swept across the yard, skimming past me where I stood quietly in the back before he launched in. "You know, Father's Day is about looking back at where we come from and looking forward to where we are going," Derek said, his voice carrying clear across the silent yard. "I look around at this beautiful house, my beautiful wife, and the life we have built, and I realize that everything I have I had to fight for tooth and nail." He took a pull from his glass and let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. "I did not have it easy. Some people get a head start in life. Some people get mentors and trust funds. But me, I had to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I had to learn what success looked like entirely on my own, because my father never understood ambition. He was just a blue-collar grinder who was satisfied with the bare minimum. He never understood what it takes to be a winner. In fact, most of my life, I had to overcome the embarrassment of coming from nothing, just to sit at the same table as all of you." A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the patio. Several guests shifted in their seats, glancing back and forth between Derek and me. Vanessa just smiled and sipped her drink as if her husband had delivered some kind of poetic masterpiece. The blood was roaring in my ears. 40 years of broken fingernails, exhausted nights, and checks written in secret, so he could walk across graduation stages without a penny of debt. And this was my reward, being used as a punchline to elevate his fragile ego in front of strangers. I stepped forward. The crowd eased apart as I moved toward my son. I kept my voice low, steady, and perfectly even. "Derek," I said, "it is Father's Day. You have had enough to drink, and I think that is enough talking for one night. Let us just leave it at that." Derek sneered, his face twisting with a sudden vicious anger. He hated being corrected, especially in front of his audience. "Do not tell me what to do in my own house, old man. You have been holding me back my entire life. You sit there in your cheap clothes judging me when you have never achieved a fraction of what I have. I am sick of pretending I owe you anything. I wish you had never been my dad." Those words hung in the air like shattered glass. I searched his face for some trace of the little boy I had raised, the boy who used to wait by the front door for me to come home from the job site. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a vain, entitled stranger who had started to believe his own lies. I did not raise my voice. I did not lift a hand. I just looked him dead in the eye, the silence stretching long enough that you could hear the wind moving through the trees. Then live as if you never had a father, I said. I turned and walked away. I did not look back at Vanessa. I did not look back at the guests. I walked straight down the driveway and left the patio behind. I didn't head toward my rusty truck sitting down the block. Instead, I walked directly to the gleaming black Mercedes SUV in the driveway. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the master key fob I had held onto when I bought the vehicle through my company, and pressed unlock. The headlights flashed. I got in, started the engine, and backed out onto the street. As I rolled down that pristine suburban road, the crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for years began to ease. What replaced it was a cold, clean clarity. For 35 years, I had been his safety net. I had let him mistake my generosity for his own genius. I had let him exploit my silence. That ended today, 10 minutes down the road. As I merged onto I-88 eastbound, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I looked at the screen. A text from Derek. "Bring my car back right now or I am calling the cops." I stared at those words. The sheer nerve of that threat would have made my blood boil a few hours ago. Now it only made me smile. I reached over, held the power button, and switched the phone off completely. Let him call, I thought as I drove into the evening. Let him call the police and report a stolen car. Because come morning, Derek and his arrogant wife were going to get a very harsh lesson in who actually owned the life they'd been living. The quiet dismantling had already started, and I was going to tear down his fabricated empire one piece at a time. I kept the Mercedes at precisely the posted speed limit as the highway unspooled ahead of me. The leather seats were perfectly shaped to the body the cabin sealed off from the world outside. It was exactly the kind of luxury Derek loved to parade around, the kind of ease he had decided was his by inheritance. I let the stillness settle over me. The phone sitting on the passenger seat had gone dark, but the memory of his text still smoldered in my mind. "Bring my car back right now, or I am calling the cops." I had switched the device off because I already knew the kind of man my son had turned into. I just hadn't expected him to prove it this fast. I assumed he was posturing, throwing a fit like a spoiled child whose favorite toy had been yanked away. I had underestimated his arrogance. 5 miles past the DuPage Cook County line, I-88 eastbound, the dark interior of the car was suddenly swallowed by strobing, violent light. Red and blue hammered the rearview mirror. The wail of a police siren split the quiet night wide open. I checked the speedometer. I wasn't speeding. I hadn't swerved. There was only one explanation for a highway patrol car bearing down on me with that kind of aggressive urgency. Derek had actually done it. My own son had picked up his phone and reported his father as a car thief. I engaged the turn signal and eased the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder. I put it in park, killed the engine, and pressed both hands flat against the top of the steering wheel. I understood how this worked. A reported stolen vehicle isn't handled like a busted taillight. It is treated as a high-risk felony stop. I checked the side mirror and watched the patrol car doors swing open. 2 officers climbed out. They didn't stroll up casually. They moved with tight, deliberate purpose. One came toward the driver's side with a hand resting near his duty belt. The other hung back, training a high-powered flashlight directly into my eyes, washing everything out. "Keep your hands exactly where they are," a firm voice commanded from behind the glare. "Do not make any sudden movements." The younger officer appeared at my window. His face was drawn, adrenaline visibly running through him. He tapped the glass. I pressed the button to roll it down, cool night air flooding the cabin. Drop the keys outside the window, he ordered, his tone sharp and final. I had already shut the engine off, but I did as he said, letting the heavy fob fall onto the gravel below. Now he said, the edge in his voice unmistakable. I need your license, and I need you out of the vehicle. You are currently driving a car that was reported stolen 10 minutes ago. I didn't argue. I didn't panic. I didn't raise my voice or try to walk him through the complicated family wreckage of a Father's Day barbecue that had gone sideways. Panicking is what guilty people do. I simply nodded. My wallet is in my back right pocket, I told him, keeping my voice level. I am going to reach for it slowly. I unclipped my seatbelt, stepped out into the cool air, and handed him my driver's license. He shined his flashlight across the small plastic card. Grant, he read aloud, glancing up at my face to check the match. Well, Grant, the registered owner of this vehicle, just called emergency dispatch, claiming you took the keys from his counter and drove off without permission. Stealing a luxury vehicle is a serious felony. Are you aware of that? I studied the young officer. He was simply doing his job, acting on the information someone had handed him. Derek had no doubt played the victim flawlessly, probably telling dispatch that his elderly father was disoriented or had taken the brand new car out of spite. I am fully aware of the law, officer, I answered, my voice low and even. But before you put me in handcuffs, I would strongly suggest you check the registration in the glove compartment. I'll stand right here against the car while you do. The officer narrowed his eyes, unsettled by my composure. He signaled to his partner, who leaned carefully into the passenger side of the Mercedes and opened the glove box. He sorted through the tidy stack of manuals and drew out the registration document. He shined his light on it, moving down the printed lines. Then he stopped. He looked at the paper. He looked at the license his partner was holding. Then he looked at me. His whole posture shifted. What does it say? The first officer asked, reading the change in his partner immediately. The second officer came around the front of the car and passed the registration over. The car isn't registered to a Derek, he said quietly. It's registered to a corporate entity, Apex Holding Group Incorporated. The first officer's expression tightened as he moved his eyes from the document to me. And what is your connection to Apex Holding Group? He asked, though the hard edge had already left his voice. I reached into my front shirt pocket and produced a small, dense business card. I held it out to him. I am the founder, the president, and the sole legal owner of Apex Holding Group, I said. I purchased this vehicle 3 weeks ago directly from the dealership, paid in full by corporate check. My son Derek drives it because I permit him to. I carry the insurance. I handle the maintenance. He does not own it. He makes no payments on it. He simply holds a spare set of keys. The two officers exchanged a long, weighted look. The first walked back to the patrol car and picked up his radio. I stood on the shoulder of I-88, listening to the crackle of dispatch as he ran the plates, the corporate registration, and my identification. A deep, clear sorrow moved through me alongside something that felt like absolute certainty. For 35 years, I had built my company from a single rusted pickup truck into a holding empire. I had structured my assets with great care, establishing trusts and corporate entities to protect the wealth I meant to leave my son. Every last piece of it had been built to keep him secure. It had never crossed my mind that those same legal structures would one day be the thing standing between him and me. 5 minutes later, the officer came back. The red and blue lights were still spinning, throwing long shadows across the asphalt, but the whole atmosphere had shifted. He returned my driver's license and business card. The keys were lifted from the gravel and placed back in my hand. You're clear, Grant, the officer said. Dispatch confirms everything. You are the legal owner of this vehicle through your corporation. You can't steal your own property. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, visibly frustrated. It appears your son filed a false police report, he went on. He used emergency resources to settle a personal family matter. That is a crime. Filing a false police report of a stolen vehicle is a serious offense, and it wastes our time. We were set to conduct a felony traffic stop on you. This couldn't have gone very badly very fast. I looked at the two officers. They were angry, and they had every right to be. They'd been played by an arrogant man who thought he could weaponize the police against his own father. I could have climbed back into that car and driven straight to my hotel, leaving Derek to face whatever came when the officers caught up with him. But the silent adjustment was never about retreating. It was about tearing down the illusion Derek had constructed around himself. Officers, I said, resting my hand lightly against the sleek black door of my vehicle. My son is at this moment hosting a very large, very expensive Father's Day barbecue at a home that happens to be owned by a blind trust I control. He's surrounded by his wealthy in-laws and his Naperville-Wheaton area country club, Naperville-Wheaton area friends, performing the role of the self-made millionaire. He believes he's won. He believes you have me in the back of a squad car right now. I paused, looking down the dark stretch of highway toward the suburb we'd just left. I don't want to see my son arrested tonight, I went on. But I do think he needs to understand just how serious it is to waste police resources and make false accusations against the man who holds the deed to the very ground he's standing on. I'm going to turn this car around and drive back to his house to collect a few personal items I left behind. I think it would be highly beneficial for everyone involved if you came back with me. This misunderstanding could be cleared up face-to-face with the person who made the false report. The two officers exchanged a glance. A slow, knowing look passed between them. They had no interest in being weaponized, and they had no objection to delivering a firm dose of reality to someone who had exploited their authority. The older officer gave a small nod, the faintest trace of a smirk at the edge of his mouth. "We'll be right on your tail, sir. Let's go have a word with your son." I headed back down the highway with the two patrol cars close behind. Their flashing lights threw frantic bursts of red and blue across the dark tree line. It was an odd procession, a silent convoy heading straight back to the place where my son believed he had ground my dignity into the dirt. I felt no fear. I felt no anger. The crushing weight of fatherly disappointment had dissolved, entirely replaced by a cold, steady calm. I was going back to deliver the consequences he had brought on himself. The affluent neighborhood sat in silence as we turned onto Derek's immaculate street. The trimmed lawns and broad oak trees were suddenly lit up by the harsh, relentless pulse of police strobes. I guided the black SUV into the driveway, dropped it into park, and cut the engine. Both patrol cars pulled in tight behind me, sealing off the driveway and the street. They left their lights running. The rotating glare cut through the night and flooded the backyard patio where the Father's Day party was still going strong. The soft acoustic music playing from the outdoor speakers went abruptly silent. Laughter gave way to confused murmurs. I climbed out of the car, an officer at each shoulder, and walked at an unhurried pace up the stamped concrete driveway. The well-heeled guests left their tables and drifted toward the patio's edge, clutching their wine glasses, staring in stunned disbelief. Vanessa was over by the outdoor kitchen, her face knotted with panic. Her parents stood beside her, looking completely lost. Derek shouldered his way to the front of the crowd. He straightened the front of his tailored chino trousers and squared his shoulders, trying to project the bearing of an upstanding citizen who had just foiled a theft. He turned to the officers and exhaled a theatrical sigh of relief. "Officer, thank you for tracking him down and bringing the car back." he said, pitching his voice so his friends from the Naperville Wheaton Area Club set could catch every word. I'm sorry for the trouble. My father had too much to drink and got out of hand. He took my keys off the counter and drove away without my permission. Vanessa moved up beside him, folding her arms and fixing me with a look of pure contempt. She was playing the role of the aggrieved daughter-in-law without missing a beat. We were just terrified he might hurt someone out there on the road, she added. I stood completely still and let them spin their story. The older officer moved forward. His expression was cut from stone. He did not look at Derek with any sympathy whatsoever. He looked at him with the flat, cold stare of a man who had no patience for liars. Are you the individual who contacted emergency dispatch to report a stolen vehicle? The officer asked. Derek nodded without hesitation. Yes, that's correct. I'm the owner, and I reported it stolen. The officer reached into his vest pocket and produced his notepad. Sir, he said, his voice carrying cleanly over the stunned hush that had settled on the patio. We have verified the registration, the vehicle identification number, and the corporate insurance documents. This vehicle is legally owned and insured by Apex Holding Group. The gentleman standing beside me is the sole proprietor of that company. You do not own this car. You do not carry the insurance on this car. You simply had a spare set of keys. The silence that dropped over that backyard was total. All you could make out was the low hum of the pool filter. Vanessa let her arms fall to her sides. Her mouth came open. She looked back and forth between the officer and Derek, the color draining from her face. The wealthy friends she'd been holding court with just an hour earlier began whispering among themselves. The image of her flawless, enviable life was cracking apart in real time. Derek went pale. The assured posture he'd walked in with collapsed. He opened his mouth, but the younger officer stepped up and cut him off. Filing a false police report is a serious criminal offense. The younger officer said, his tone sharp and without mercy. Using emergency dispatch to resolve a family grievance is a gross misuse of public resources. We were fully prepared to execute a felony traffic stop on your father. We have the authority to put you in handcuffs right now, walk you to our cruiser, and book you into the DuPage County Jail in Wheaton for making a false declaration to law enforcement. Derek took a step back. The self-made millionaire facade dissolved on the spot, leaving behind nothing but a frightened, foolish boy. He stumbled over his words, frantically trying to walk it back in front of his audience. Officer, there has been a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded, his voice gone high and thin. I maintain the vehicle. We had a verbal agreement. I genuinely believed it was legally mine. The older officer shook his head slowly. You lied to a 911 dispatcher, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. We are issuing you a warning tonight only because your father specifically asked us not to arrest you in front of your guests on Father's Day. But if we are ever called back to this address, because you chose to waste our time with another false report, you will be leaving in handcuffs. Do you understand me? Derek swallowed hard and gave a small, meek nod. Yes, sir, he whispered. I looked out over the crowd. Vanessa's face had gone a deep, burning crimson. She could not bring herself to meet her friend's eyes. Her father, the pompous man who had sung Derek's praises so loudly during the toasts, was staring at his son-in-law with unconcealed disgust. He was a man who measured people by wealth and standing, and learning that his son-in-law was a fraud who drove a borrowed car and lied to the police was nothing short of a social execution. His Naperville Wheaton area set awkwardly studied their shoes or raised their glasses to their lips, doing their best to pretend they weren't watching a man be utterly destroyed. Derek looked at me. His eyes were wide with a mixture of desperation and dread. He was waiting for me to step in. He was waiting for me to smooth it all over, to tell Vanessa's parents it was a silly mix-up, that I was glad to let him keep the car. That was what I had always done. My whole life I had absorbed his failures and underwritten his pride. But I did not say a single word to him. I simply walked past him and stepped up onto the patio. The crowd opened up for me without hesitation. I went inside, picked up the light jacket I'd left folded over a dining chair, and walked back out. As I moved past Derek on the driveway, he leaned in close, his voice shaking. "Dad, please," he breathed. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell Vanessa's parents we have an arrangement. You're humiliating me." I stopped and looked at the man who had stood in front of a crowd and wished he'd never had me for a father. I looked at the woman who had paraded everything I'd built as if it were her own birthright. "I'm just a blue-collar grinder, Derek," I said quietly, low enough that only he could hear it. "I don't know anything about your high society misunderstandings. You're a self-made man. Handle it yourself." I walked the rest of the way down the driveway, thanked both officers for their time and their professionalism, and settled back into the driver's seat. As I reversed away from the curb, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. Derek was standing completely alone in the unrelenting wash of police lights, surrounded by people who were seeing him clearly for the very first time. I woke the next morning to rain, tapping quietly against my bedroom window. After leaving the subdivision the night before, I had driven straight home. My place was a modest brick ranch I'd purchased 30 years ago. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that normally settled my mind, but that morning it sat heavy on my chest. I went to the kitchen and switched on the coffee maker. The motions were familiar. Everything else felt different. I poured a cup of black coffee and took a seat at the small wooden table. My phone had been sitting in the center console of my truck all night. I hadn't wanted to touch it. I knew exactly what was waiting for me on that screen, but avoidance stops being an option the moment someone decides to come after you. I walked out to the garage, retrieved the phone, and brought it back inside. When I lit up the screen, notifications came flooding in. 15 missed calls in total. 10 from Derek. 5 from Vanessa. A stack of text messages sat below them, but I left them unread. I opened my voicemail app. One new message from my son left at 2:00 in the morning. I pressed play and set the phone down on the table. Derek did not sound like a man who had just been publicly shamed and brought low. He sounded like a cornered animal swinging wildly at everything within reach. The alcohol from the barbecue was still clearly in his blood, thickening his voice and sharpening the aggression in it. "I cannot believe you did this," he began, his voice trembling with a fury so raw it was distorting the recording. "You completely destroyed my life tonight. Vanessa has locked herself in the guest bedroom and won't say a word to me. Her father told me I am a disgrace. My partners at the firm watched the police handle me like a common criminal. You humiliated me in front of every person who matters. You stole my car and set me up to look like a fool." I took a slow sip of coffee. He still called it his car. Even with the police having handed him the cold, hard facts, he could not release his grip on the fiction he had built. He was incapable of owning it. It was simpler to blame the man who had given him everything. But the rant did not stop at blame. His voice shifted from rage to something colder and more deliberate. "You are not thinking straight, Dad." He went on, the venom laced into every syllable. "What you did last night, taking a vehicle like that, wandering off into the dark, trying to make a scene with the police, that is not normal behavior. Vanessa and I have been talking. We have noticed you slipping for some time now. You are acting erratically. You are making dangerous choices. We think you are suffering from early onset dementia. We genuinely believe you are becoming senile." The kitchen was absolutely still, The only sound in the room was the harsh mechanical reproduction of my son's voice. See, I'm not going to let you tear down the family name because your mind is going. Derek said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening whisper. I am calling my lawyer first thing Monday morning. We are going to petition the court for a conservatorship. You clearly cannot manage your own affairs any longer. Someone needs to step in and take control of your assets and your medical decisions before you harm yourself or someone else. You pushed me to this, Dad. I am going to take over everything. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. The automated voice informed me the message had been saved. I sat at my kitchen table staring out at the rain. A deep, profound coldness moved through me. If he had called to scream at me, I would have understood it. If he had called to cut ties and tell me he never wanted to lay eyes on me again, I would have accepted it. I would have mourned the loss of my son and lived out whatever years remained to me in quiet solitude. But walking away was not what he wanted. He wanted to put me in a cage. A conservatorship is not some minor legal tool. It is the wholesale stripping away of a person's fundamental rights. If Derek succeeded, he would control where I slept, what I ate, which doctors I saw, and how every dollar of my money was spent. He would hold the power to place me in a nursing home, close the door behind him, and never look back. He would take the corporate empire I had built with my own hands and drain it dry to fund his country club, Naperville, Wheaton area lifestyle, and Vanessa's designer wardrobe. My own money would pay the lawyers who locked me away. I understood in that moment that I was no longer dealing with an ungrateful child. I was dealing with a predator. Derek and Vanessa had grown comfortable on the wealth I had provided, and they had decided they no longer cared to wait for me to pass on naturally. They wanted that inheritance now, and they were prepared to strip away my mind and my freedom to claim it. They figured I was just a tired old man with no fight left in him. They assumed legal jargon and threats of incompetency would be enough to break me. They had forgotten where I came from. I did not inherit my company. I built it from nothing in the dirt. I had outlasted economic downturns, ruthless competitors, and cutthroat corporate predators. I knew how to fight. I had simply never imagined I would need to turn those skills on the boy I once taught to ride a bicycle. I picked up the phone. I did not delete the voicemail. I backed it up to a secure cloud server. That recording was no longer just a wounding message from a son. It was evidence of premeditated malice. It was proof that his sudden theatrical concern for my mental health was nothing more than a legal weapon aimed squarely at my assets. I stood up from the table and poured the rest of my coffee down the drain. There was no longer any time for grief. Grief was a luxury available only to people who were not under threat. I was under active attack. I walked into my home office and pulled open the heavy steel filing cabinet. I drew out my corporate ledgers, trust documents, and property deeds. I needed to move faster than they did. I needed to sever every financial lifeline I had ever extended to them. Before Derek could file a single page with any court, before they could make their move to declare me incompetent, I had to act. They believed they held the power. They were about to learn that every bit of power they had ever possessed, I had quietly paid for. I reached for my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Clifford Dunning. Clifford was my lead corporate attorney. Brilliant, relentless, and fiercely loyal to me. He had handled every acquisition and blind trust in my portfolio. He barely knew Derek because I had always kept my business and my family in separate worlds. That separation was finished. I pressed the call button and listened to it ring. It was time to pull the foundation out from under my son's feet. It was time to begin the silent adjustment. The phone rang exactly twice before Clifford answered. It was Sunday morning, but Clifford Dunning never truly stopped working. He was a man who lived in tailored suits and breathed corporate litigation. When he picked up, his voice was crisp and sharp. I told him I needed to see him at his office immediately. He didn't ask questions. He simply said the coffee would be ready and the door would be unlocked. I grabbed my briefcase, the one carrying the physical ledgers of Apex Holding Group, and walked out to my truck. The drive into the city was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gray under the pale morning light. I thought about the man I was going to see. Clifford had served as my lead counsel for over 15 years. He had managed the acquisitions, the mergers, the intricate trust structures that kept my wealth shielded from public view and from my family. He was a shark in a courtroom, a man who dismantled rival operations with surgical efficiency. I had always kept him at a distance from Derek. I had wanted my son to have a normal father, not a legal apparatus. But Derek had forced my hand. He wanted a war over assets. He was going to get one. I arrived at the towering glass and steel building in the Chicago Loop Financial District. The lobby was empty. The security guard waved me through with a familiar nod. I rode the elevator up to the 38th floor. When the doors slid open, Clifford was already waiting in the glass-walled conference room that looked out over the city. He handed me a cup of black coffee as I stepped inside. He studied my face, reading the cold tension in how I carried myself. He knew at once that this was not a routine portfolio review. I settled into a seat at the long mahogany table and set my phone in the center of it. There was no small talk. I simply pressed play on the voicemail Derek had left me. My son's recorded voice filled that pristine corporate space. The threats of a conservatorship, the accusations of senile dementia, the flat declaration that he intended to take over everything. Clifford listened in complete silence. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He simply watched the phone, absorbing every word. When the message ended, the silence in the room pressed down like weight. I looked at Clifford, and he looked back at me. I told him my son believed I was a vulnerable old man. I told him Derek planned to file legal papers to have me placed in a facility so he could drain my accounts and fund his country club, Naperville-Wheaton area memberships, and his wife's designer wardrobe. I told Clifford that for 35 years I had played the part of the quiet, generous, blue-collar father. That was over. The facade was gone. I was no longer Derek's father in that room. I was the president of Apex Holding Group, and my company was under active attack. Clifford leaned forward and laced his fingers together. His eyes were sharp, already mapping the legal battlefield ahead. He asked me what my objective was. He asked whether I wanted a defensive strategy to block the conservatorship petition. He suggested we could arrange independent medical evaluations to establish my competency before Derek even filed the paperwork. I shook my head. Defensive strategies belong to men who fear losing. What I told him was this: I wanted a complete and total offensive. I wanted to dismantle every financial structure propping up my son's existence. I wanted every lifeline of wealth I had ever extended to him cut clean, and I wanted it done before Derek even felt the blade coming. Clifford gave a slow nod, a quiet, predatory smile settling at the corners of his mouth. He crossed to his workstation and pulled up the master files for Apex Holding Group alongside the various blind trusts I had built over the decades. The wall screen blazed to life with spreadsheets, bank accounts, and property deeds. We began the silent dismantling right then and there. It was a ruthless, methodical reckoning with my own generosity. We started with the Residential Property Trust. I watched the screen as Clifford brought up the deed to the sprawling colonial house where Derek and Vanessa lived. I had acquired that property for them 5 years ago through a shell corporation. They believed I had simply co-signed a highly favorable mortgage on their behalf. The truth was, I owned it outright. They were in every legal sense tenants living there rent-free. The property taxes, the upkeep, the sweeping renovation. Vanessa had just finished on the outdoor kitchen. All of it had flowed through anonymous corporate accounts on my orders. Clifford asked for my instructions. I told him to prepare an immediate 30-day eviction notice. They would either vacate the property or execute a new commercial lease at the actual market rate of $8,000 a month. Next came the credit lines. I had quietly secured a high-limit corporate credit card account that Vanessa and Derek used for their everyday spending. They assumed it was a corporate perk attached to Derek's position, a marker of his supposed standing at the firm. What they never knew was that I was clearing the full balance from a private trust at the close of every quarter. We pulled the current statement. The figures were breathtaking. $5,000 charges at jewelry boutiques, $2,000 charges at luxury wellness spas, receipts for lavish dinners and weekend getaways stretched down the page. Seeing those numbers lined up in sequence made one thing unmistakably clear: they weren't simply living well. They were gorging themselves. They treated my invisible safety net like a bottomless well. Clifford had weathered corporate embezzlement, hostile takeovers, and boardroom treachery. Yet even he seemed quietly appalled by the sheer river of money flowing toward a man who had publicly cast me aside. He asked what I wanted done with the cards. Freeze them immediately, I said, and leave the outstanding balance exactly where it sits. Let them reckon with the mountain of compound debt they had quietly built for themselves. For 4 hours we sat in that conference room and traced every dollar. We went through the insurance policies, the memberships at the country club, Naperville, Wheaton area, the vehicle registrations. It was nauseating to see it all rendered in black and white. I had underwritten an entire illusion. I had funded my son's arrogance. I had bankrolled the very lifestyle that convinced him he was inherently above me. I had fashioned a monster out of nothing but blind, foolish love. As we finalized the roster of accounts to be permanently severed, Clifford flagged an irregularity inside a secondary property portfolio. He paused, his brow creasing as he clicked into a folder of banking documents I had never authorized. He leaned toward the screen, eyes moving carefully across a recent application from a local financial institution. When he looked up at me, his expression had shifted from corporate attorney to something closer to a detective. He told me Derek hadn't merely been enjoying my hidden generosity. He told me my son had recently taken steps that crossed from selfish entitlement into outright financial crime. The audit had just surfaced something far graver than an ungrateful child. We had found a paper trail capable of sending him to a federal prison. Clifford keyed his secure credentials into the main terminal. The large glass monitor on the conference room wall came alive, flooding the dim room with rows of precisely organized financial data. This was the core of everything I had built. For decades I had fed this empire with my sweat, my aching joints, and countless sleepless nights. I watched the cursor travel across the screen as Clifford opened the first encrypted folder. It carried a simple alphanumeric label, but I knew precisely what lived inside. It was the blind trust holding the deed to the suburban colonial house where Derek and Vanessa had made their home. Let us start with the primary residence, Clifford said quietly, his voice carrying a faint echo in that large room. He brought up the original purchase agreement. 5 years ago, Derek had come to me frustrated and humiliated. He'd been passed over for a promotion at his firm, and Vanessa was insisting they leave their starter apartment behind. She wanted a house that matched the social station she believed was owed to her. Derek's credit was a wreck at the time, buried under student loans and a string of poor financial choices. He couldn't qualify for a mortgage on a property of that scale. So I did what any father desperate to guard his son's pride would do. I established a blind trust through my corporation. I had Clifford draft a fictitious mortgage agreement, one with incredibly favorable terms, and presented it to Derek as a rare opening from a private lender I trusted. Derek was convinced he had negotiated a brilliant arrangement entirely on his own. He thought he was paying a fraction of market rate to some faceless institution. In reality, my holding company purchased the property outright for $2.5 million in cash. Derek was simply writing a modest monthly check to a holding account, which I then quietly redirected into an investment fund for his future children. I covered the steep property taxes. I paid the homeowners association fees. I even absorbed the cost of the sprawling outdoor kitchen renovation. Vanessa had just completed routing the funds through a shell contractor, so no trail would lead back to me. Clifford highlighted the total expenditures on the property across the last 5 years. The figure at the bottom of the column was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been poured into sustaining their fiction of wealth. Prepare the documents to dissolve the tenancy agreement. I told Clifford, my voice level and emptied of feeling. I want a formal eviction notice drafted at once. They have 30 days to clear out entirely. If they choose to remain, they will sign a new commercial lease at the actual market rate of $8,000 a month. Clifford nodded, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as he logged my instructions. The decisiveness of it felt like relief. I was reclaiming the ground beneath their feet. Next, Clifford opened the revolving credit lines. This was the piece that genuinely turned my stomach. I had quietly secured a high-limit corporate credit card account that Vanessa and Derek ran their daily lives on. They believed it was a corporate perk tied to Derek's role, a sign of his supposed value and standing at the firm. They had no idea the card drew directly from my private trust, or that I was clearing the full balance at the end of every single quarter. We reviewed the current quarterly statement. Clifford scrolled through the charges, the spreadsheet painting a vivid and revolting portrait of their excess. $5,000 runs at luxury jewelry boutiques, $2,000 visits to exclusive wellness spas, receipts for expensive meals at 5-star restaurants, weekend trips to coastal resorts, and thousands more spent on designer clothing. They were not simply living comfortably, they were bleeding me dry. They treated my invisible safety net like a bottomless well, spending with reckless abandon, because a declined card was something they had never once had to face. Clifford stopped scrolling and looked over at me. His expression stayed professional, but I could see the quiet horror behind his eyes. He had stewarded the fortunes of extraordinarily wealthy people throughout his career. Yet watching a son so brazenly exploit a father he publicly claimed to despise, that was a different order of tragedy entirely. "What do you want to do with the credit lines?" Clifford asked, his tone measured. "I can have the accounts closed completely within the hour." "Do not close them," I said, my eyes fixed on the massive negative balance filling the screen. "Freeze them. Suspend all future authorizations immediately, but leave the current outstanding balance exactly where it is. Transfer the liability to their personal names, as per the original guarantee agreement they signed, without reading properly." Clifford raised an eyebrow, a slow understanding moving across his face. By freezing the cards and shifting the liability, I was dropping more than $60,000 in compound debt squarely onto their shoulders. The moment they reached for their card at a coffee counter, or tried to settle their next tab at the country club, Naperville, Wheaton area, it would decline. The illusion would collapse in an instant. "Consider it done," Clifford said, drafting the authorization orders. For the next 2 hours, we sat in that conference room, tracking every single dollar. We audited the premium vehicle insurance policies I had been covering. We audited the Naperville Wheaton Area Country Club, Naperville Wheaton Area initiation fees I had quietly subsidized. We audited the expensive wine club deliveries that showed up at their door each month. I had bankrolled an entire fabricated existence. I had paid for my son's arrogance. I had financed the very lifestyle that convinced him he was inherently better than the blue-collar grinder he called his father. Out of pure, blind, unconditional love, I had made a monster. I believed I was shielding him from the hardships I'd known, but all I'd really done was insulate him from the character-forging truth of hard work. I had stolen his humility, and in exchange he had stripped me of my dignity. I watched the screen as Clifford methodically cut every financial umbilical cord. With each click of the mouse, another lifeline was severed. The relief that moved through me was enormous, like finally shrugging off a heavy, suffocating coat at the end of a long and grueling journey. I was no longer a prisoner of my own generosity. I was the president of Apex Holding Group, and I was protecting what was mine. As we completed the list of accounts to be permanently cut off, Clifford turned his attention to the secondary property portfolio, the commercial buildings and undeveloped land parcels I held for future investments. A routine review to confirm no unauthorized charges had crept into those accounts. Then Clifford's fingers went still. He leaned closer to the screen, eyes moving carefully across a recent application document from a local financial institution. His brow drew tight, the sharp lines of his face hardening into a look of intense concentration. "Grant," Clifford said, his voice dropping an octave, turning dead serious. "Have you authorized any new credit facilities against the lakeside cabin on Lake Namekagon, Wisconsin in the last 48 hours? I shook my head, a cold knot taking shape in my stomach. "No," I answered. "I haven't touched that property in years. It's owned free and clear by the holding company." "What are you seeing?" Clifford angled the monitor so I could read the document myself. He no longer looked like a corporate attorney. He looked like a criminal investigator who had just turned over the right rock. "Because," Clifford said slowly, tracing a line across the screen with his pen, "it appears your son hasn't simply been enjoying your quiet generosity. He has recently taken desperate steps that cross from selfish entitlement into outright financial crime." I stared at the screen, my heart beating hard, a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. The audit had uncovered something far darker than an ungrateful child. We had found a paper trail capable of landing my own son in a federal prison. Clifford enlarged the document, and the stark white glow of the digital file lit up the dim conference room. I leaned forward, palms resting on the cool mahogany table. The header was unmistakable. It was a formal application for a home equity line of credit, a loan for $150,000 drawn against my lakeside cabin on Lake Namekagon. That property was a modest, quiet retreat I had purchased 30 years ago for my late wife and me. It was where we spent our summers, where I had taught Derek to fish when he was just a little boy. My eyes moved to the bottom of the first page. A signature executed in black ink. My name written in a flowing cursive loop that looked entirely convincing at a glance, but I knew the subtle breaks in the lettering. I knew exactly how the pen should lift after the first initial. What was on that screen was a meticulous, painstaking forgery. Derek had sat somewhere, maybe at the very kitchen table I had bought, and practiced signing his own father's name again and again, until he had it right. Clifford tapped his pen against the desk. "The application was submitted to a regional bank in Naperville, IL, 3 days ago," he said quietly. "The loan officer flagged it for a routine verification check because the property is held under the corporate trust, but the application came in under your personal name. If they hadn't caught that discrepancy, the funds would have been dispersed by Tuesday." A cold tightening gripped my stomach. A bank doesn't hand over $150,000 to a third party without substantial supporting documentation. I asked Clifford to open the attached files. I needed to see exactly how far my son had gone to secure this money. He clicked the mouse, and a new set of scanned pages filled the screen. The first attachment bore the letterhead of a private medical clinic 2 towns over. I read it slowly, my heart dropping like a stone. It was a physician's evaluation. The letter stated that I had recently been examined and diagnosed with advanced cognitive decline. The fake doctor detailed how I was suffering from severe memory loss, erratic behavior, and an inability to make sound financial decisions. The evaluation concluded I was wholly unfit to manage my own affairs and required immediate familial intervention. The phrasing on that screen mirrored almost word for word what Derek had hurled at me in that furious voicemail that morning. It was no spontaneous outburst born from anger over a missing car. It was a calculated story he had been constructing behind my back for weeks. He had obtained a fraudulent medical diagnosis to legally erase my autonomy. He was laying the groundwork to strip away my freedom so he could take my money. Clifford scrolled to the final document in the file. It was a durable power of attorney. The legal form handed Derek full and absolute control over my finances, my properties, and my medical care. It was stamped with a counterfeit notary seal and signed with another flawless forgery of my name. I sat back in my chair. The air in the room felt thin. For 35 years, I had loved that boy. I'd carried him on my shoulders when his legs gave out. I had stayed up late working through his math homework beside him. I had quietly moved mountains to make sure he never tasted failure or financial ruin. And in return, he had actively conspired to have me locked away in a facility, erase my legal existence, and drain the very assets I had built for his future. This was not the careless entitlement of a spoiled child. This was the cold, calculated malice of a criminal. Clifford closed the file. His face was grim. He told me that filing these forged documents with a financial institution constituted multiple federal crimes. He listed them one by one: wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, uttering forged instruments. The penalties carried severe mandatory prison sentences. Then Clifford looked me directly in the eye and put the hardest question of the day to me. Was I prepared to send my only son to a federal penitentiary? I turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city skyline. The storm clouds were breaking apart, letting shafts of harsh sunlight fall across the glass towers. I thought about the man who had stood at that barbecue sipping a glass of aged scotch, telling 60 strangers he wished I had never been his father. I thought about Vanessa showing off a car she didn't own and laughing at my expense. I thought about the fake doctor's note designed to have me thrown into a locked ward so they could pick through everything I'd spent a lifetime building. I turned back to Clifford. I told him I no longer had a son. What I had was a parasite who had just signed his own eviction notice from society. I instructed Clifford to download every piece of evidence from the bank portal: the forged signatures, the fraudulent medical evaluation, the counterfeit notary stamp, all of it compiled into a single master file. I told him not to contact the police yet. I didn't want Derek arrested quietly at home where he could play the victim and craft a story for his wealthy friends. I wanted him to face the reality of what he had done with his own eyes. I wanted him sitting across a table from me, completely unaware that the ground had already disappeared beneath him. I told Clifford to finalize the documents, severing the remaining financial ties, and to have the evidence ready for the authorities. Then I picked up my phone. I was going to invite my son and his wife to a meeting to discuss my estate. I was going to let them believe their cruel scheme had worked. I walked out of Clifford's office in the Chicago Loop Financial District with a heavy heart and a clear mission. The forged documents were safely secured, a ticking time bomb waiting for the right moment. But before I could spring the trap, there was one more asset I needed to protect. It wasn't money or property. It was the only thing I had left of her. What I was about to uncover in the hours that followed the full extent of what my own son had been doing right under my nose changed everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. Before we get there, tell me honestly, if someone you loved and trusted had been quietly working against you, would you confront them face to face, or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth speak for itself? I drove across town to the main branch of my bank in the Chicago Loop. It was a massive, imposing structure of marble and glass, a place where fortunes were stored and secrets never surfaced. I walked past the tellers and headed straight for the vault manager's desk. An older woman with keen eyes and a sympathetic expression looked up as I neared. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone soft and professional. How can I help you today?" "I need to access my safe deposit box," I replied, my voice tight. "Box number 3117. She nodded, entering something into her computer. "Of course. Let me verify your authorization." I watched her face for any trace of hesitation. I knew the box was held in my name, but I had listed Vanessa as an emergency contact years earlier, back when I still believed she was family. I had never once imagined she would exploit that privilege. "Everything appears to be in order," she said, rising from her chair. "Follow me, please." We passed through a heavy steel door and into the vault, a labyrinth of metal boxes holding the city's concealed wealth. She stopped before box 317 and inserted her key. I turned mine and the small door swung open. I reached in and withdrew the long, rectangular metal box. It felt strangely light in my hands. I set it on the small table in the center of the room and slowly lifted the lid. My breath stopped in my chest. The box was empty, not completely empty. A single folded piece of paper lay at the bottom. I reached in and picked it up. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely make out the words. It was a receipt from the Cicero IL shop dated 2 weeks ago, signed by Vanessa. I stared at that slip of paper, struggling to absorb what I was looking at. The receipt listed a diamond necklace, a pair of emerald earrings, and a vintage Rolex watch. These were my late wife's pieces, jewelry. She had treasured things I had set aside for the daughter I never got to have. And Vanessa had sold them off for $30,000. $30,000. That was the price she had placed on my wife's memory. The cost of a designer bag, a weekend escape, a fleeting indulgence. A wave of nausea swept through me. It wasn't only the theft, it was the utter desecration of everything I held sacred. "Mr. Whitmore," the vault manager said, her voice thick with concern. "Are you all right?" I looked up, my vision swimming with tears of pure fury. "When did she access the box?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Whitmore came in 2 weeks ago," she replied gently. She presented her identification and the emergency access authorization. I processed the request myself. "Did she say why she needed access?" "She said you were ill, Mr. Whitmore. She said you needed the jewelry to cover medical expenses." I shut my eyes, a single tear tracing its way down my cheek. They had weaponized my supposed illness, a convenient fiction, to strip away the only things that truly mattered to me. "Thank you," I said to the vault manager, my voice cold and flat. "I need you to freeze this box immediately. No one is to have access except me. Not my son, not his wife, no one." "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. I'll enter the notation right now." I walked out of the vault, the Cicero shop receipt gripped tightly in my fist. It was the final piece of evidence I required. I didn't go back to Clifford's office. I drove straight to the shop in Cicero IL, listed on the receipt. It was in a rundown part of town, a long way from the manicured lawns and country clubs of Derek and Vanessa's world in the Naperville, Wheaton area. I stepped into the dimly lit place, the smell of dust and quiet desperation thick in the air. A man with a heavy gold chain and a suspicious glare tracked me from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough. I set the receipt down on the glass counter. "I want to redeem these items," I said, my voice level. "They belong to me." The man lifted the receipt and studied it. "These pieces were sold by a Vanessa Whitmore," he said, eyes narrowing. "You her husband, I am her father-in-law." I answered, my gaze steady. "And those items were stolen from my safe deposit box." The man paused, then reached beneath the counter. "I can't just hand them over, buddy. I paid good money for these." "I am well aware of what you paid," I said, producing a thick envelope of cash I had withdrawn earlier. "Sir, I am prepared to reimburse you the full $30,000, plus whatever interest you consider fair. But I am walking out of here with my wife's jewelry today." The man looked at the cash, then back at me. He saw the resolve in my eyes, the quiet promise of a confrontation he had no interest in starting. He slowly pushed a small velvet box across the counter. "$35,000, he said, his voice low. I handed him the envelope. "Count it." I opened the box. The diamond necklace caught the dim light and sparkled, a ghost from a life I desperately missed. The emerald earrings, the watch, all of it was there. I closed the box and walked out. The weight of this jewelry was a physical echo of the betrayal I had endured. I sat in my truck for a long while, the engine idling, rain beginning to fall again. The silence was deafening. I had been betrayed by my own son, robbed by his wife, and treated like a senile old fool who existed only as a source of money. But I was not an old fool. I was Grant Whitmore, and I was going to make them pay. I set the velvet box on the passenger seat and pulled out onto the slick road. The drive back to the Chicago Loop Financial District was a blur of gray skies and wet asphalt. The crushing weight of betrayal had lifted. In its place was a crystalline, cold focus. I knew exactly what had to be done. If I simply handed the evidence to the police at that moment, Derek would find a way to reframe it. He would hire a defense attorney to argue the forged loan application was a misunderstanding and that Vanessa had sold off the jewelry with my verbal consent. I needed them cornered in a room where their lies had nowhere to go. I needed to be present for the exact moment the illusion they had constructed on my back came apart completely. I took the elevator back up to the 38th floor. Clifford was still in the glass-walled conference room, finishing up the paperwork we had gone over earlier. When I walked in and laid the Cicero receipt on the mahogany table beside the velvet box, Clifford stopped typing. He looked at the receipt, then at the jewelry, then at me. He needed no explanation. He grasped the full depth of the depravity we were up against. "Are we calling the authorities now?" Clifford asked quietly. I shook my head. "Not yet. If we call them now, Derek gets to play the victim in his own home. He gets to act stunned and bewildered for the neighbors. I want him here. I want both of them sitting directly across from me when the walls come down. I want the financial crimes detective waiting in the next room." Clifford nodded slowly. "A trap." "Exactly," I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It had been off since I left the DuPage Cook County line, I-88 eastbound, the night before. I powered it on. A flood of missed calls and furious texts filled the screen, but I ignored all of it. I opened a new message to Derek. I had to swallow every ounce of my pride to write those words. I had to inhabit the role they had written for me. I had to become the confused, worn-out old man they were convinced I was. I typed slowly, making certain the tone was perfectly pitiful. "Derek, I am so sorry about last night. I think I am just very tired. My memory has been slipping and I have been feeling so confused lately. You were right. I cannot manage all of this on my own anymore. Please meet me at my attorney's office tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I want to discuss my estate hand over the responsibilities and make things right with you and Vanessa. Please forgive me. I stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, aimed squarely at his colossal arrogance. Derek was firmly convinced he was the sharpest mind in any room. He believed his forged documents and his bluster had driven a senile old man into submission. We did not have to wait long. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a reply. Dad, I'm glad you're finally coming to your senses, Derek wrote. This is for your own good. Vanessa and I will be there at 10 sharp. We're bringing our own counsel to oversee the transition. Make sure the paperwork is ready. I showed the reply to Clifford. We shared a grim, wordless understanding. Derek was bringing his own lawyer. He was walking straight into a federal fraud ambush and bringing an audience to watch his own undoing. Let him bring whoever he wants, Clifford said, turning back toward his screen. His lawyer is going to need his own lawyer before we're finished with him. For the rest of that afternoon, Clifford and I built the iron trap. Every document was printed, verified, and slipped into neatly organized black folders. The repossession orders for the Mercedes and the SUV were finalized. The eviction notice for Derek and Vanessa's suburban colonial house, Naperville, IL, was signed and notarized by the Blind Trust. The authorization to freeze all credit lines and transfer the enormous compound debt directly into their personal names was poised to execute with a single phone call. Then Clifford placed the most important call of the day. He reached a senior detective in the Financial Crimes Division, someone he'd worked alongside on several major corporate fraud cases. Clifford laid out the full picture: the forged home equity loan application, the counterfeit notary seal, the falsified medical documents. He also mentioned the pawn jewelry and the false police report filed the night before. The detective didn't hesitate. He agreed to be at the office by 9:45 the following morning, stationed in the adjoining room until the trap was sprung. I spent that night in a quiet hotel near the Chicago Loop Financial District. I had no desire to return to my empty house. I ordered something simple from room service and sat watching the city lights pulse against the dark beyond the window. A deep, steady calm settled over me. The storm had broken, and what it left behind was a cold, hard clarity. I thought about the boy I had raised. I remembered standing in the backyard showing him how to grip a baseball and throw it properly. I remembered the surge of pride when he walked across that graduation stage, a milestone I had funded through years of grinding physical labor. But somewhere along the way, I came to understand that the boy I remembered had been gone for a long time. The man who had taken his place was a parasite, a creature bred on greed and unearned entitlement. I grieved the son I'd lost, and felt not one drop of pity for the man I was about to bring down. Tomorrow morning, Derek and Vanessa would walk into that conference room, expecting to be handed the keys to everything I had built. They would expect me to sign away my rights, my independence, and my dignity. They were expecting a surrender. What they were going to get was an execution. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. The city spread out beneath us through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 38th floor. It was exactly 10:00 in the morning. The heavy oak doors swung open. Derek came in first, wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his chin angled upward with an air of total triumph. He looked like a man arriving to claim a throne. Vanessa followed a step behind, carrying a designer handbag and wearing oversized sunglasses, which she peeled off slowly as she took in the room. Her expression was somewhere between boredom and barely concealed hunger. She sighed loudly, complaining about downtown traffic and having to cancel her morning spa appointment for this. Behind them came a third man. He had on a gray suit that ran a size too small and carried a scuffed leather briefcase. He had the twitchy, restless energy of someone who made his living in the gray zones of the law. This was the counsel Derek had brought along to witness my surrender. Derek did not greet me the way a son greets his father. He didn't ask how I was holding up or whether I'd slept. He pulled out a chair for Vanessa, then dropped into the seat directly across from me. He laced his fingers together on the table and exhaled a long, patronizing breath. "Dad, I'm glad you finally decided to stop making this so difficult," Derek said. His voice was laced with manufactured sympathy, but his eyes were cold and triumphant. "We're all very busy, and I appreciate that you're taking responsibility for your declining mental state." I said nothing. I simply looked at him. Clifford stood quietly by the window, a plain black folder at his side. The man in the too-tight gray suit cleared his throat and set his briefcase on the table. He snapped the brass latches open with a sharp crack. "I'm Mr. Pryor," he announced, squaring his shoulders slightly. "I represent your son and daughter-in-law. We have prepared the necessary legal instruments to facilitate a smooth transfer of your assets and medical proxies into Derek's control." Mr. Pryor drew out a thick sheaf of documents and pushed them across the polished wood toward me. He glanced at Clifford with the easy dismissiveness of a man who assumed my attorney was nothing more than a glorified notary waiting to rubber stamp my defeat. "What you're looking at is a comprehensive, durable power of attorney paired with a voluntary conservatorship agreement," Mr. Pryor said smoothly. "By signing today, you grant Derek full legal authority over your personal finances, your corporate holdings, and your medical decisions. It's the cleanest path forward, given your current cognitive difficulties. It keeps this out of open court." I looked down at the papers. The arrogance was breathtaking. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to collect. Vanessa shifted impatiently in her chair. "Honestly, Grant," she sighed, studying her manicured nails, "you should be thanking us. Not many families would be willing to take on the burden of managing someone in your condition. We're sacrificing a great deal of our own time to see that you're placed in a proper care facility. A nice one, of course, but it's still a massive undertaking on our part." Derek nodded gravely and laid a hand over Vanessa's. "It's a sacrifice we're prepared to make," he said, holding my gaze. "But to do this properly, I need absolute control over the holding company and the blind trusts. The property we're currently living in needs to be transferred directly into our names so we can leverage the equity to cover your medical care." I listened to them spin their web of lies. They were remarkably comfortable with their cruelty. They genuinely believed they were looking at a broken old man who had already given in. They had no idea that a financial crimes detective was sitting fewer than 20 feet away in the adjoining room, taking in every word. Clifford moved from the window and came to stand beside my chair. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't offer Mr. Pryor a handshake. He simply let his gaze fall on the stack of documents lying on the table. "My client has reviewed your proposal," Clifford said, his tone flat and professional. "Before any signatures are provided, however, we have a few housekeeping matters to address concerning the current state of the estate." Mr. Pryor waved a hand. "We have no interest in delaying this with minor estate details. My clients are prepared to assume full control immediately. If your client declines to sign, we are fully prepared to file the medical evaluations we've obtained with the judge this afternoon and have him declared legally incompetent." I looked at Derek. He was reclined in his chair, a smug curl at the corner of his mouth. He believed he held the ultimate card. He was certain those forged medical documents were an unbeatable trump. "You obtained a medical evaluation stating I'm incompetent?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and uncertain, playing exactly the role they expected. "Yes, Dad, we did," Derek said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. We had a professional assess your recent behavior, the erratic actions taking the car, the obvious memory lapses. The doctor concluded, you are a danger to yourself. We have the signed evaluation right here. He patted a secondary folder that Mr. Pryor had set on the table. He was openly acknowledging possession of the forged document in front of witnesses. He was digging his own grave and polishing the shovel. It really is for the best, Vanessa chimed in. You can finally rest. No more worrying about bills or maintaining properties. Derek will handle the company. We'll make sure your legacy is put to good use. Her eyes glittered with undisguised greed. She was already spending my money in her head, probably mapping out her next vacation or her next designer splurge, completely unaware that her credit cards had been frozen hours ago. I looked at the pen Mr. Pryor had placed on top of the documents. An expensive silver pen. He gestured toward it, nudging me to pick it up and sign away my life. I did not touch the pen. I laid both hands flat on the cool mahogany surface and let the silence stretch, letting their arrogant smiles hang in the air a moment longer. I wanted to burn this image into my memory. The smug, entitled expressions of two people who believed they had swindled a lifetime of hard work away from an old man. You're right about one thing, Derek, I said, and the pretense of hesitation left my voice entirely. My tone was no longer soft. It was cold and sharp. I am finally going to rest. I'm not going to worry about paying your bills or maintaining your properties anymore. Derek's smile faltered. He sensed the shift in my demeanor, but his arrogance kept him from understanding the danger he was standing in. Good, he said slowly. Then pick up the pen and sign the papers, Dad. Let's get this done. I reached down to the briefcase at my feet. I did not pull out a pen. I pulled out 3 perfectly organized black folders and set them squarely in the center of the table, right on top of their fraudulent conservatorship documents. I'm not signing anything, Derek, I replied. But you're going to want to look at what I've brought you. The transition of my assets begins right now. I slid the first black folder across the polished mahogany. It came to rest directly in front of Vanessa. She eyed it with suspicion before flipping it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the official letterhead of Apex Holding Group and the seal of a corporate repossession agency. What is this? Vanessa asked, her brow creasing behind those oversized sunglasses. And that I said, leaning back in my chair, is an official repossession order. It is being executed as we speak. I canceled the insurance and the registration on the Mercedes SUV this morning. I also canceled the registration on the Range Rover you drive to your luncheons at the country club, Naperville-Wheaton area. Tow trucks are at your house right now, pulling both vehicles out of the driveway. Vanessa's jaw dropped. Her sunglasses slid down the bridge of her nose. You're towing our cars! She gasped, her voice climbing. Grant, you cannot do that. How are we supposed to get anywhere? They are not your cars, Vanessa. I said, my voice level and cold. They belong to my corporation. I allowed you the use of them. But since Derek feels I'm nothing but a blue-collar grinder who held him back his entire life, I decided it was time to pull my hand away. You're entirely self-made now. Go purchase your own vehicles. Derek stared at me, the color draining from his face. He looked between me and Clifford, trying to work out whether this was a bluff. Dad, you're joking, right? He stammered. You're trying to teach me a lesson. I get it. Point made. Call the tow company and tell them to turn around. I didn't break eye contact. I reached out and slid the second black folder across the table. It stopped directly in front of Derek. I'm not teaching you a lesson, Derek, I replied. I'm severing a liability. Open the folder. Derek reached for it, his hands trembling slightly. He flipped the cover back. The document inside bore the name of a real estate holding trust, the same blind trust that owned his sprawling suburban colonial house in Naperville. It was an unofficial notarized notice of eviction. That you have 30 days to vacate the premises. I explained, watching his eyes move across the legal language. The trust that owns your house has formally terminated your tenancy at will. If you and Vanessa wish to remain in the property past that 30-day deadline, you'll need to execute a commercial lease agreement. The actual market rate for that property is $8,000 a month. First and last month's rent plus a security deposit will be due immediately upon signing. Derek looked up, his eyes wide with shock and raw panic. $8,000 a month, he choked out. Dad, we cannot afford $8,000 a month. We have the mortgage. You don't have a mortgage, Derek, I said, my voice cutting clean through his panic. You never had a mortgage. I purchased that house for $2.5 million in cash through a blind trust. I set up a fictitious payment structure so you'd feel like a man who'd earned his own home. Every small check you wrote over the last 5 years went into a holding account. I paid the taxes. I paid the homeowners association fees. I even paid for the outdoor kitchen Vanessa was bragging about yesterday. You are not a homeowner, Derek. You are a squatter who just received an eviction notice. Mr. Pryor. The sleazy lawyer Derek had brought along snatched the eviction notice out of Derek's hands. He scanned it rapidly, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. His face turned an ashen shade of gray. He glanced at Clifford, who remained silently by the window, projecting the quiet authority of a corporate executioner. Mr. Pryor understood instantly that he was completely outmatched. The paperwork was ironclad. Vanessa buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, theatrical sob. "This is a nightmare," she wailed. "What are we going to tell my parents? What are we going to tell the club? We are going to be homeless." Derek slammed his fist on the table, the impact ringing through the conference room. "You cannot do this to me," he shouted, his composure completely shattered. "You are my father. You are supposed to protect me. You are supposed to take care of me." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. "I did protect you, Derek," I said quietly, but with force. "I protected you from failure. I protected you from financial ruin. I stood between you and the harsh reality of the world I had to fight through to give you the life you had. And you rewarded me by trying to have me locked in a nursing home. You rewarded me by publicly disowning me in front of everyone. I am done protecting you." I tapped the third black folder, the last one remaining on my side of the table. "But we're not done transitioning my assets. There is still the matter of your debt." Derek stared at the eviction notice, his mouth opening and closing, like a man searching for air in a room that had none left. He looked to Mr. Pryor, whose gray complexion had deepened to a sickly pallor. The lawyer pushed the document back toward Derek and gave a faint, grim shake of his head. The silence in the room pressed down heavy and suffocating. Vanessa sat frozen, both hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles drained white. I didn't let the silence linger. I slid the third black folder across the wood. It nudged against the corner of the eviction notice. Derek didn't reach for it. He looked at it the way a man eyes something dangerous coiled on the ground in front of him. "Oh, go ahead, Derek," I said. "Open it." With unsteady hands, Derek lifted the black cover. What was inside was neither a legal brief nor a corporate memo. It was a consolidated statement from the high-limit credit lines he and Vanessa had been running to fund their extravagant lifestyle. The current balance was printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the page. $62,450. "No, those are your corporate credit cards," I said, watching his eyes move across the itemized list of luxury purchases. "You always assumed they were a perk tied to your supposed value at the firm. In reality, they were drawn from a private trust I established." I cleared the balance at the end of every quarter. I paid for your dinners, your vacations, your jewelry, your entire illusion of success. Vanessa's head snapped up. Her eyes darted from the statement to my face. The realization struck her like something physical. As of 9:00 this morning, I said, settling back in my chair. I froze those accounts. I suspended all future authorizations, and per the guarantee agreement you both signed 5 years ago without reading properly, I have formally transferred the full liability of that outstanding balance directly into your personal names. All color left Vanessa's face. $60,000, she whispered, her voice shaking. We cannot pay that. Our cards will decline. We will be ruined. She turned on Derek, her panic curdling into fury. You told me those were company perks. You told me we were fine. Derek ignored her. He was fixed on the number on the page, the full weight of his financial destruction, finally breaking through his arrogance. He understood in that moment that he had no safety net, no hidden funds, no secret accounts. Everything he had was built on my money, and I had just closed the bank. Dad, you cannot do this! Derek said, his voice rising, panic bleeding into anger. You are trying to bankrupt us. You are trying to destroy my life because of one stupid argument at a barbecue. It was not one argument, Derek. I replied, my voice steady and unmovable. It was 35 years of ungrateful entitlement. It was watching you publicly disown the man who paid for the ground you walk on. I am not destroying your life. I am simply making you live the life you actually earned. Which, as it turns out, is absolutely nothing. The cold truth of those words finally broke him. Derek brought both hands down on the mahogany table with everything he had, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. He shoved back from the table so hard his chair shrieked across the floor. You crazy old man! He was screaming now, face gone, a deep, mottled crimson veins standing out along his neck like rope. You think you can just play God with my life? You think you can cut me off and leave me with nothing? He lunged across the table, snatching the stack of documents Mr. Pryor had brought, the fabricated psychiatric evaluation and the counterfeit power of attorney. He shook them in the air, eyes wild with cornered fury. I am not letting you do this, he shouted, spittle catching the light. You are senile. Your mind is going. I have the medical evaluation right here. I have the power of attorney. I am taking you to court, Dad. I am going to stand before a judge and prove you are entirely incompetent. I will have you placed in a facility so fast it'll make your head spin, and I will take every last dime of that company. You cannot stop me. His composure was gone completely. He was a frightened, cornered creature brandishing his forged papers like a weapon, wholly unaware that he had just openly confessed to his crimes in front of a room full of witnesses. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I sat perfectly still and let his rage exhaust itself in the clean, quiet air of the conference room. I glanced at Clifford, who stood calmly near the window. Clifford did not look at Derek. He looked at the door leading to the adjoining office. You are going to take me to court, Derek? I asked, my voice low and deliberate. You are going to stand before a judge holding those documents? Yes. Derek spat, slamming the forged papers back onto the table. I am going to take everything from you. I nodded slowly, a cold and settled satisfaction taking hold deep in my chest. Then I suggest you grip those papers tightly, Derek. I said, because you are going to need them to explain yourself to the federal authorities. Derek went rigid at the far end of the table. His hand still rested on the stack of fraudulent documents, but the fierce color had drained from his face in an instant. The words federal authorities seemed to ring off the glass walls of the conference room like a struck bell. He turned to Mr. Pryor, but the attorney was already edging away from the table, his gaze fixed on the door to the adjoining office. Clifford said nothing more. He simply reached beneath the broad lip of his polished mahogany desk and pressed a concealed button. We held in absolute silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then the heavy wooden door at the far end of the room clicked open and swung slowly inward. A man stepped into the conference room. He was not wearing an expensive tailored suit like Derek or Clifford. He had on a plain gray jacket over a white shirt, a silver badge clipped squarely to his leather belt. He carried the tired, watchful eyes of a man who had spent his career unraveling the intricate deceptions of desperate people. He was a senior detective from the Financial Crimes Division, and he had been seated in the next room listening to every arrogant word Derek had just screamed. The detective crossed to the table and stopped directly beside Clifford. He looked down at the papers Derek was clutching. His expression held not a trace of amusement. "If you are acting as legal counsel for the individuals holding those fraudulent documents," the detective said, addressing Mr. Pryor, "I strongly suggest you consider your next move with great care. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud and uttering forged instruments carry mandatory federal sentences." Mr. Pryor did not hesitate. He did not attempt to defend his clients or parse legal technicalities. He recognized a sinking ship on sight. He seized his worn leather briefcase, snapped the brass latches shut, and walked directly toward the exit. He did not even glance at Derek. He simply muttered that he was withdrawing his representation, effective immediately, and all but sprinted out the main doors. Derek watched his attorney abandon him, his mouth working open and shut in silent shock. He looked at the detective, then he looked at me. The polished, self-made millionaire facade had vanished entirely. He was just a frightened boy realizing there was no one left to come clean up his mess. "Dad." Derek whispered, his voice trembling so badly the words barely formed. "Dad, what is happening? Who is this man?" I reached into my briefcase one final time. I drew out a plain manila envelope and set it on the table. I slid it across the polished wood until it rested right beside the forged psychiatric evaluation Derek had been waving around moments before. "That man is a detective, Derek," I replied, keeping my voice measured and even. "Because 3 days ago you submitted an application for a $150,000 home equity line of credit against my lakeside cabin on Lake Namekagon, Wisconsin. You used a counterfeit notary seal. You provided a fabricated medical evaluation, declaring me mentally incompetent, and you forged my signature." Derek's knees seemed to buckle beneath him. He dropped back into his chair, hands shaking uncontrollably as he stared at the manila envelope. He tried to speak, to deny it, to spin another lie, but the breath had left his body. The absolute certainty in my voice and the physical presence of law enforcement had immobilized him. I turned to Vanessa. She was pressed hard against the back of her chair, looking as though she wished she could disappear through the wall. She believed she was a mere bystander to Derek's corporate crimes. She told herself she was safe because her name appeared nowhere on the forged loan application. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced a small, folded piece of paper. I did not slide this one across the table. I held it up where she could see it plainly. "2 weeks ago, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, hard edge, "you used your standing as my emergency contact to gain access to my secure bank vault at the main branch in the Chicago Loop. You informed the vault manager I was gravely ill and required funds for medical care. You cleared out the box and took my late wife's heirloom jewelry. Then you walked into that pawn shop, Cicero IL in Cicero IL, and sold $30,000 worth of diamonds and emeralds to pay for your designer wardrobe." Vanessa let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Tears welled immediately, spilling through her makeup. She looked at Derek, silently begging him to say something, anything, to shield her. But Derek was staring blankly at the detective, entirely consumed by his own oncoming ruin. "I tracked down that pawn shop, Cicero IL, in Cicero IL, Vanessa," I continued without mercy. "I bought the jewelry back. I have the receipt bearing your signature. It is sitting in an evidence file on that detective's desk right now. Grand larceny is a serious felony." Vanessa dissolved into loud, heaving sobs. She buried her face in her hands, crying that it had been a mistake, that she had not understood what she was doing, that Derek had pressured her to find money so they could keep up appearances. The bond between them fractured on the spot as she frantically tried to save herself by turning on her husband. She wept and insisted she was a victim of his financial control. Derek looked at me, tears finally running down his pale face. He understood that the fortune he had felt so entitled to was gone beyond recovery. He understood that the social standing he had craved was in ruins. He understood that his freedom now rested entirely with the man he had publicly humiliated just 48 hours before. "Dad, please," Derek begged openly, weeping now. "Please do not do this. I am your son. I made a terrible mistake. We were desperate. I will do anything. I will go to rehab. I will go to therapy. I will pay back every single penny. Please, you cannot let them send me to prison. I will not survive it." He reached across the table, his hands grasping at nothing, reaching for the safety net that had always caught him before he could hit bottom. He expected me to give way. He expected the father who had quietly covered his mortgage and cleared his debts to come forward and rescue him one last time. I looked at the boy. I had loved the boy I had spent my entire life shielding. I felt a deep and hollow grief, but not one particle of pity. I had given him every possible chance to become a decent man, and he had elected to be a predator instead. He had stood before a room full of wealthy strangers and sneered at the calluses on my hands. He had tried to have me confined to a care facility so he could strip away everything I had built. I rose from my chair slowly and fastened the button on my suit jacket. I looked down at him, my face carved from stone. "I am not senile, Derek," I said, delivering the final truth without hesitation. "I am simply no longer your safety net. You wanted to live as though you had no father. Now you do." I turned away from the table and walked toward the exit, leaving my son and his wife in tears with the detective standing by to read them their rights. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, but my feet didn't carry me away just yet. I stood in the still carpeted hallway and turned back around. The glass walls gave me a perfect soundproof view into the collapse of my son's fabricated empire. The detective moved forward and pressed both hands flat against the table. He was done observing. He was taking formal control. I could see the cold authority in the set of his shoulders. He reached to his belt, drew out a pair of steel handcuffs, and set them directly on top of the forged medical evaluation. The sight of those metal restraints snapped whatever thin thread of hope Derek was still holding on to. He dropped to his knees beside the mahogany table, clasping his hands together in a wretched plea. His mouth moved frantically, begging the detective, begging the empty air, begging a father who had already turned away. He looked like a terrified child, but he was a grown man, staring down the very real weight of federal crimes. He jabbed a finger toward the door. I just walked through, his face twisted in desperate agony. Vanessa didn't fall to her knees. She stepped back from Derek as though he were carrying something contagious. The partnership they'd built to bleed me dry dissolved instantly in the face of prison time. She began waving her hands in the air, pointing her finger squarely at her husband. Even through that thick glass, I could follow the frantic movement of her lips. She was feeding him to the wolves to spare herself. She shook her head sharply, denying any part in the forged documents or the false medical evaluation. She gestured toward the pawn shop, Cicero IL receipt, trying to pin the stolen jewelry on Derek, claiming he'd forced her into it to cover his debts. Derek looked up at his wife with absolute horror. The betrayal must have cut him to the bone. The woman he had lied for, the woman he had stolen for, the woman he had tried to have his own father locked away, for she was now eagerly handing him over to law enforcement. He reached out to take her hand, but she pulled back in revulsion. She shouted at him, her face flushed with frantic rage, telling the detective she was nothing more than a victim of his financial abuse. She wove a story of manipulation and deliberate ignorance kept in the dark about the true nature of the holding company and the blind trusts. The detective didn't appear the least bit persuaded. He had worked enough white-collar cases to know the panicked lies of a guilty spouse scrambling for the exit. He reached calmly for his radio and said a few words. Barely a minute passed before the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway slid open. 2 uniformed officers stepped out and moved briskly past me toward the conference room. Neither one glanced my way. They had their orders and were moving to secure the suspects. Clifford stepped out of the conference room and came to stand beside me in the hallway. He smoothed his tie and let out a long, slow breath. He told me the detective was formally charging Derek with forgery, identity theft, and attempted bank fraud. He told me Vanessa was being taken into custody for grand larceny in connection with the stolen heirloom jewelry. They would be processed at the DuPage County Jail, Central Precinct in Wheaton, IL, and held until their arraignment. No bail would be posted today. They'd be spending the night in orange jumpsuits, surrounded by the unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system. I watched through the glass as the 2 officers approached Derek. They told him to stand and put his hands behind his back. He resisted for just a moment, shaking his head, tears running freely down his face. One officer grabbed his arm firmly and turned him around. The metallic snap of the cuffs locking around his wrists registered in my mind, even though I couldn't hear a sound. His shoulders buckled forward. The sharp charcoal gray suit he was wearing suddenly looked absurd, a costume belonging to a man who no longer existed. Vanessa fought her arrest. She backed herself into the corner of the room, sobbing and pleading with the officers in hysterics. She thrust her wrists forward, protesting that the metal cuffs would mark her skin. The officers extended no sympathy. They secured her wrists and read her rights. She looked utterly pathetic, every trace of her arrogant country club, Naperville, Wheaton area persona stripped away, reduced to a weeping criminal. She fixed her eyes on Derek with pure, undisguised hatred, blaming him entirely for the destruction of her comfortable life. The officers guided them toward the conference room door. Clifford held it open wide with a perfectly neutral expression. Derek came out first, his head bent low. When he caught sight of me standing in the hallway, he stopped. He looked at me with eyes swollen and red. He opened his mouth to beg me one final time to call off the lawyers and undo the damage. He wanted me to tell the police it had all been a misunderstanding. He wanted me to be the father who always swept up after him. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stood like a wall of solid stone. I looked at him, not with anger, not with grief, but with complete indifference. Whatever had once existed between us was gone. I told him quietly that he needed to keep walking. I told him the holding company would not be posting his bail and that he should ask for a public defender when he got to the precinct. I told him he was finally the self-made man he'd always claimed to be. Derek let out a broken sob and dropped his head. The officers nudged him forward, steering him toward the elevators. Vanessa came out next. She did not look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, her designer sunglasses hanging uselessly from her shirt collar. She was crying loudly, the sound carrying down the long corporate corridor. They were walked into the waiting elevator car, the steel doors sliding shut and cutting them off from the world of wealth and privilege they had tried to take. Clifford and I made our way to the bank of monitors in his security office to watch them leave the building. The high-definition cameras in the main lobby offered a perfect, unobstructed view of their final humiliation. The lobby of the Chicago Loop Financial Tower was alive with executives, bankers, and corporate attorneys, many of them. People Derek had spent years trying to impress the elite circles he'd burned himself chasing. The elevator doors opened at the ground floor. The two uniformed officers walked Derek and Vanessa out into the bright, wide lobby. The low hum of the morning rush fell silent almost immediately. Executives stopped mid-stride, briefcases in hand, staring. I watched as several people Derek knew personally recoiled as he was walked past them in steel handcuffs. The arrogant image he'd spent his entire adult life constructing was obliterated in front of the people who mattered most to him. Vanessa tried to shield her face behind her bound hands, weeping openly, while the stares of well-dressed strangers pressed in on her. She had spent that morning making herself presentable to claim my estate. Now she was enduring a walk of shame that would be talked about in boardrooms and at the country club, Naperville-Wheaton area for years. They were steered through the revolving glass doors and into the back of a waiting police cruiser parked hard against the curb. Clifford returned to the mahogany table in the conference room and gathered the forged documents, placing them carefully back into his briefcase. He told me the detective had taken the pawnshop Cicero IL receipt and the counterfeit power of attorney as evidence. The federal investigation would formally begin the following morning. The bank that had flagged the forged loan application would be notified, and the fraud department would build an airtight case against them. There was no exit. The evidence was overwhelming, and their own panicked words inside the conference room had sealed everything. I crossed to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the streets below. The police cruiser eased away from the curb, merged into the thick downtown traffic, and disappeared. A deep exhaustion moved through me like a tide. The adrenaline from the confrontation was draining away, leaving in its place the quiet ache of a father who had just cut out a diseased part of himself to go on living. Clifford brought me a fresh cup of black coffee. We stood together without speaking for a long time, watching the city. He told me the immediate fallout was only the opening act. The weeks ahead, he warned, would be grueling: court dates, depositions, and the very public unraveling of Derek's world. I nodded and took a slow pull of the bitter coffee. The road stretching out in front of me would be long and painful, but I knew I had already survived the worst of it. The poisonous fiction had been broken apart, and I was finally free. The weeks that followed that morning in the conference room passed with a slow, measured cadence. I did not reach out to my son. I did not respond to the frantic letters his public defender mailed to my office. Justice moves at its own unhurried pace, but it grinds with extraordinary precision. I filled my days at the holding company and spent my evenings on the back porch of Grant's brick ranch house in Joliet, IL. The quiet I had been starving for finally settled over my life. But while my world grew still, the world Derek and Vanessa had constructed was tearing itself violently to pieces. The first thing to fall was Derek's career. He had always traded on his position at Derek's investment firm in the Chicago Loop, using my invisible financial backing to project the image of a powerful rainmaker. But the financial sector is a tight, suspicious community. When the federal investigators started pulling bank records and questioning loan officers about the forged equity application, The rumors moved through the industry like fire through dry grass. A detective visited the firm to subpoena his corporate emails and audit his digital footprint. By the end of that week, Derek was summoned to the managing partner's office. He was not offered a severance package. He was not given the option to slip out quietly and salvage his reputation. He was terminated immediately for cause and walked out of the building by private security. His personal belongings arrived at his door in a plain cardboard box. He had to move past his colleagues carrying nothing but his coat, enduring the weight of their silent, judgmental stares. The whispered exchanges in the elevators and break rooms confirmed his total professional destruction. Without his salary, and without my quiet infusions of cash, the full reality of their compounded debt came crashing down. The 30-day eviction notice I had served them expired without a single dollar of rent paid. They ignored every notice gambling that I would relent and call off the attorneys. I did not relent. On the 31st day, the county sheriff arrived at Derek and Vanessa's suburban colonial house in Naperville, IL, to execute the eviction order. The same neighbors who had attended that extravagant Father's Day barbecue stood on their trimmed lawns and watched the whole spectacle play out. Uniformed deputies stood by while moving crews hauled custom leather furniture, designer clothing, and high-end espresso machines out to the curb. Derek argued with the officers, gesturing wildly and demanding more time, but the corporate paperwork was absolutely airtight. The physical evidence of their failure was put on open display for the whole neighborhood to witness. The house was locked, the keys were surrendered back to my trust, and they were left standing on the sidewalk with nowhere to turn. The social banishment was swift and total. People who anchor their relationships in money scatter the instant the money is gone. Vanessa tried contacting the wealthy women from the country club, Naperville, Wheaton area, hoping to arrange personal loans or at minimum a temporary place to land. Her calls went straight to voicemail. Her messages sat unread. The club management quietly canceled their membership, citing unpaid dues and the moral turpitude clause in their contracts. The same friends who had eagerly drained their champagne and laughed at my expense now treated them like something to avoid. They were pariahs from the only high society they had ever cared about. Stripped of their luxury vehicles and their prestigious address, they were left to rent a dismal room in a cheap motel, spending the very last of their loose cash to do it. The country club, Naperville, Wheaton area elite closed ranks and erased Derek and Vanessa from their collective memory. Desperation makes people ruthless. As the federal charges against Derek hardened, Vanessa concluded that her husband was a sinking ship. She packed her things, slipped out of the motel room in the middle of the night, and filed for divorce. She hired a cut-rate lawyer and tried to construct a public story that she was an innocent victim of a controlling, manipulative man. She told anyone who would listen that Derek had concealed his financial crimes from her and that she had fled for her own protection. She believed that throwing him to the wolves would earn her immunity. She believed she could simply walk away, shed her married name, and find another wealthy man to bankroll her life. She badly misjudged the competence of the Financial Crimes Division. While she was busy filing divorce papers, the detective had been methodically tracing the pawn shop Cicero IL transaction. He pulled the high-definition security footage from the store. He matched the signature on the pawn receipt directly to her driver's license. He confirmed with the bank vault manager at the bank, main branch, Safe Deposit Vault, Chicago Loop, that she had used false pretenses to gain access to my safe deposit box. A week after she filed for divorce, officers arrived at the small apartment she was renting on borrowed money. They had no interest in her sob story or her tears. They put her in handcuffs and formally indicted her for grand larceny and possession of stolen property. Her bid to abandon the sinking ship only landed her in a different jail cell, The woman who had once sneered at my blue-collar roots was forced to trade her linen-wrapped dresses for a standard-issue orange uniform, enduring the humiliating ritual of being fingerprinted and photographed like a common criminal. The financial collapse was now total. The credit card companies, recognizing that the accounts were frozen and deeply defaulted, launched aggressive collection efforts. Since I had legally transferred the liability into their personal names, their credit scores vanished overnight. The luxury clothing, the spa retreats, the lavish dinners, all of it converted into crushing, insurmountable debt. They had absolutely nothing left to liquidate. No property, no vehicles. They were bankrupt in every conceivable sense of the word. They were forced to apply for public defenders because no private attorney would touch a complex fraud case without a retainer. Derek made one last attempt to reach me. He called my office from the DuPage County Jail, Central Precinct, Wheaton, IL, while waiting for his arraignment hearing. He bypassed the receptionist and left a desperate voicemail on my direct line. He was sobbing into the receiver. He told me he was terrified. He said the other inmates were threatening him and that he couldn't survive a federal prison sentence. He begged me to post his bail. He swore he would spend the rest of his life working off the debt if I would just get him out of that concrete cell. I sat at my desk and listened to the recording. A faint sorrow surfaced for the little boy I had raised, the one who used to wait by the door for me to come home from the construction sites. But I felt absolutely nothing for the grown man on that recording. The boy was gone. The man had made his choices. I deleted the message and told my receptionist to block all future calls from the county correctional facility. The illusion they had spent years carefully assembling was gone completely. The house sat empty and listed for sale by my holding company. The luxury cars had been auctioned off to recover their depreciated value. They had chased wealth with such blind, consuming greed that they ran straight off a cliff, expecting me to be waiting at the bottom to catch them. I followed the legal proceedings from a distance, reading the brief weekly updates Clifford sent me. I did not attend their court hearings. I had no desire to see their faces again. The quiet adjustment was complete. I had reclaimed my life, my assets, and my peace of mind. I had finally forgiven myself for enabling their arrogance across so many years. The toxic cord had been cut for good, and the beautiful, steady silence was finally mine to hold on to. The suburban house sold in under a week. The real estate market had an appetite for sprawling colonial estates, and the cash buyer had no concern for the drama those walls had witnessed. The day the final paperwork cleared, I felt a deep and genuine sense of closure. The millions of dollars moved cleanly back into the holding company, severing the last tangible link to my son's extravagant illusion. I instructed Clifford to liquidate the remaining luxury vehicles. The proceeds were directed into a newly established trust fund. I kept not a single dollar of those sales for myself. I sat down with Clifford and drafted the charter for the Loretta Whitmore Memorial Foundation. My late wife had always believed in the dignity of honest work. She had packed my lunch pails during the lean contractor years and cheered every small win as we built our life one hard day at a time. The foundation was set up to offer full-ride scholarships to young men and women heading into the blue-collar trades, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, the very people Derek had sneered at from across his barbecue. The money he had burned buying his way into the country club, Naperville, Wheaton area, would now go toward building futures for kids who actually knew what a dollar cost to earn. My own life shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. I handed the daily running of Apex Holding Group off to my senior executive team. I was 70 years old, and I had finally absorbed the hardest lesson my years had to offer. Assembling an empire means nothing if you hollow yourself out getting there. I held on to Grant's brick ranch house, Joliet, IL, but the city saw little of me after that. I bought a small wooden cabin sitting quietly on the shore of Lake Namkagon, Wisconsin, deep in the Northwoods. It was not a luxury property. No manicured grounds, no heated pool. What it had was creaking floorboards, a fieldstone fireplace, and an unobstructed view of the water. That was enough. It was more than enough. The quiet out there was a different creature entirely from the silence I had carried for 35 long years. The old quiet had the weight of a swallowed tongue of protecting my son's brittle ego at the cost of my own. This new silence was something else, light restorative. Wind threading through the pines. Water nudging softly against the dock planks. I filled my days reading, patching up the old wooden deck, and fishing. I no longer had to play the role of a simple, worn-down retiree. I was just Grant, a man who had finally come by his rest, honestly. Autumn settled in and painted the Northwoods in deep golds and burning crimson. I was out on the back porch one morning, wrapped in a heavy fleece pullover, a mug of strong black coffee warming my hands. The air carried that bite of early fall damp earth and wood smoke drifting together. A thin mist lay over the surface of the lake. I watched a pair of herons wading near the shoreline. No members of the country club, Naperville-Wheaton area, to perform for. No forged documents to chase down. Just the unhurried rhythm of things that had been going on long before me, and would keep going long after. My phone sat on the little wooden table beside the rocking chair. I barely touched it anymore. Clifford checked in once a week with updates on the foundation, but beyond that, the outside world, and I had reached an unspoken agreement to leave each other alone. As I raised the mug to my lips, the phone jumped to life against the wood. The screen blazed on, splitting the calm of the morning wide open. I glanced down at it. Unknown number. Not a local area code. One of those generic prefixes, the kind tied to prepaid burner phones or the phone systems inside institutions. I knew exactly who was on the other end. I didn't need a name on the screen to read that desperate signal. The criminal proceedings were almost certainly in their final stretch. A federal prison sentence was bearing down on him. He was calling from some bare room, scraping together whatever coins he had left banking on the hope that the father he'd tried to put away would pick up and produce a miracle. He wanted the safety net to materialize out of thin air. I sat there watching the phone shudder across the tabletop. The ringing seemed to swell, filling the porch, the sound of a man going under, grabbing for anything solid. A brief flash crossed my mind, a small boy sprinting across a sunlit yard. It dissolved almost the moment it arrived. That child was long gone. The man dialing my number was someone I no longer recognized, a stranger who had tried to take my life from me. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. What I felt was a deep, settled peace. I reached over and picked the phone up. I didn't press accept. I didn't press decline. I got up from the rocking chair, crossed to the edge of the porch, and let the ringing phone drop into the heavy metal trash can. It struck the bottom with a clatter, the vibration buzzing dully against the tin walls, and then it went still. I turned away from the trash can and moved toward the wooden rack leaning against the cabin wall. I lifted my old fishing rod, the cork grip worn silky smooth from years, in my hand. I took my small tackle box and headed down the wooden steps toward the dock. That morning on the dock, with nothing but the sound of water and the weight of everything behind me, I finally understood what it meant to be free. This road cost me more than I can put into words. It cost me the version of my son I had chosen to believe in for decades. It cost me years of silence and swallowed pride of watching the people I provided for look right through me. But I believe God does not let that kind of patience go unrewarded. The Lord's timing is rarely what we would choose, but looking back, every step landed exactly where it needed to. These are the things I would tell any man or woman carrying what I carried. First, never confuse loyalty with surrender. Staying quiet to keep the peace is not love, it is slow erasure. Second, document everything. The truth that saves you is the truth you can prove. Third, the people who dismiss your past are often living off it. Let the records speak. Fourth, real family justice does not come from revenge. It comes from standing in your own name, in your own light, and letting the facts do what threats never could. These father stories, the ones nobody talks about at holiday dinners, are the ones that need to be heard. If this one reached something in, you share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment and tell me what moment hit you hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Alpha Dad Stories so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself out there, and I'll talk to you again soon.